In the land between two rivers, where civilization first drew breath and the gods walked among mortals, ancient voices whisper through millennia of sand and stone. The Anunnaki, divine beings who shaped destiny, who decreed the fates of kings and commoners alike, whose temples touch the heavens and whose myths echo still through the ages. Tonight, journey into the dawn of human imagination to discover the gods who gave us writing, who built Ziggurats to bridge earth and sky, and whose stories became the foundation of the world we know. This is the tale of the Anunnaki. Imagine stepping through a gate of time, into a world where rivers carve their paths through sun-baked plains, where mud brick walls rise against endless skies, and where the air itself seems to hum with the presence of powers older than memory. This is ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, a place where civilization first took shape and where the gods walked among their creations. Here, in cities whose names echo across millennia, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Babylon, people looked to the heavens and saw not mere stars, but the homes of deities who shaped their fates. They pressed reeds into wet clay, creating the first written words, preserving stories that would outlast empires. They built great stepped pyramids that clawed at the sky, believing that at their summits, mortal priests might commune with the divine. And they spoke of the Anunnaki, a pantheon of gods whose power was absolute, whose judgments determined the course of human existence. The Anunnaki were not minor spirits or household gods. According to Sumerian belief, they stood at the very foundations of reality itself. They were the ones who decreed fates, who separated heaven from earth, who taught humanity the arts of kingship and agriculture and writing. To understand the Anunnaki is to peer into the spiritual imagination of the world's first urban civilization, to see how ancient people made sense of their place in the cosmos. But who exactly were these gods? The answer shifts like desert sand depending on which clay tablet you read, which city-state claimed which deity as patron, which era of Mesopotamian history you examine. The Anunnaki were both consistent and contradictory, both clearly defined and mysteriously vague. Some texts number them at 50, others at 300, still others at 600. Some describe them as celestial beings dwelling in the highest heavens. Others place them in the underworld, serving as judges of the dead. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the historical record, but rather a window into how religious belief evolved across centuries and cultures in this fertile crescent of human innovation. The very name, Anunnaki, offers our first clue to their nature. Most scholars translate the Sumerian term as something approximating those of princely seed, or offspring of the prince. Though like so much about these deities, the precise etymology remains debated. What's clear is that the Anunnaki represented the highest tier of the divine hierarchy, gods among gods, the offspring of An, the sky god who ruled over all. An, sometimes called Anu in the Akkadian language that would later dominate the region, was the supreme deity of the Sumerian pantheon. His name literally meant sky or heaven, and he personified the vast dome above, that unreachable realm where divine power concentrated in its purest form. An's consort varied depending on the source. Sometimes she was Ki, the earth goddess. Other times, Antu, a sky goddess. From these primordial unions came the Anunnaki, gods who would govern everything beneath the highest heaven. Among the Anunnaki, certain names appear again and again across the cuneiform tablets. Enlil, the god of air and storms, often served as the functional head of the pantheon in practical matters. The deity who separated heaven from earth in the beginning and who wielded terrible power over wind and weather. The Sumerians believed that until Enlil's birth, sky and earth existed as a single, undifferentiated mass. It was Enlil who tore them apart, carrying away the earth while his father, An, claimed the sky. His cult center stood at Nippur, a city so sacred that control over it conferred legitimacy on Mesopotamian kings for thousands of years. Then there was Enki, called Ea in Akkadian, the god of fresh subterranean waters, of wisdom, of magic and crafts. Enki ruled the Abzu, that mysterious realm of groundwater that fed the springs and wells upon which Mesopotamian agriculture depended. He was clever, sometimes too clever, a divine trickster who saved humanity from annihilation more than once through his quick thinking. The city of Eridu claimed him as its patron, and some scholars believe Eridu may have been among the very oldest of Sumerian settlements. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, represented fertility and the life-giving power of the earth. Some texts identify her with Ki herself, making her both earth and the mother of gods. She appears in myths as a creator, as a mediator between gods, and as one whose anger could be as terrible as her blessings were generous. Other Anunnaki included Nana, the moon god worshipped especially at Ur, Utu, who personified the sun and justice, and Inanna, the complex goddess of love, war, and political power, whose cult would later merge with that of Ishtar. Each major city claimed at least one deity as its special patron, and these gods were understood to literally dwell within their city's temples, inhabiting statues that priests would dress, feed, and care for, as one might attend to an honored guest. Yet, for all their individual identities, the Anunnaki were also invoked as a collective group, particularly when texts needed to reference divine authority in general. Legal documents might call upon the Anunnaki as witnesses to oaths. Curses might invoke them to punish oath-breakers. Myths spoke of them gathering in assembly to decree the fates of mortals and gods alike. In the poem, Enki and the World Order, the Anunnaki do homage to Enki, singing praises and taking up their dwellings among the Sumerian people, twice declaring that they decree the fates of mankind. This fate-decreeing function appears central to how the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki's role. The ancient Mesopotamians did not believe in random chance. Everything that happened, from the flooding of rivers to the rise and fall of kings, reflected divine will. The Anunnaki were the ones who determined these outcomes, who set the patterns by which the world operated. To earn their favor was to prosper. To anger them was to invite disaster. But there's another Anunnaki tradition that seems to contradict their celestial nature. In Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, one of the most haunting poems to survive from ancient Sumer, the goddess Inanna journeys to the realm of the dead ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. There, she encounters 7 Anunnaki, who serve as judges, passing sentence upon her for the hubris of attempting to conquer death's domain. These underworld Anunnaki condemn Inanna to death, suggesting a chthonic function quite different from the sky-dwelling fate-decreers described elsewhere. How do we reconcile these different roles? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that the Anunnaki concept evolved over time. What began as a term for the highest gods might have gradually shifted to also include deities associated with the underworld, or different cities and traditions may have emphasized different aspects of these gods' nature. The fragmentary nature of the surviving texts means we're trying to reconstruct a vast, complex religious system from scattered pieces, like assembling a massive puzzle with most of the pieces missing. To understand how we know anything about the Anunnaki at all, we must turn to one of ancient Mesopotamia's most revolutionary innovations: writing. Long before alphabets, before the libraries of Greece or the scrolls of Egypt, Sumerian scribes were pressing reed styluses into wet clay, creating the world's first true writing system. Walk through the streets of ancient Uruk around 3200 BCE, and you might see a priest administrator emerging from the temple complex, clay tablet in hand. The tablet is still damp, soft enough to receive impressions but firm enough to hold its shape. In his other hand, he carries a stylus cut from a reed, its tip carved to a triangular edge. He has just finished recording the temple's grain receipts. So many measures of barley from this farmer, so many from that one. Payment for services rendered, allocations for festival preparations. These earliest tablets were purely practical, accounting documents that tracked the complex economic transactions of temple estates. The symbols were pictographic, simple drawings that represented concrete things: a jar for beer, an ox head for cattle, a star shape for the god An. But Something remarkable was about to happen. Over the following centuries, these practical records would evolve into a system capable of recording anything language itself could express. Prayers and hymns, legal codes and royal propaganda, mathematical treatises and epic poetry. The key innovation came when scribes realized they could use pictures not just for what they depicted, but for the sounds their names made. This is called the rebus principle. The same concept at work when modern English might draw an eye and a heart and a picture of you to express "I love you." By 2600 BCE, Sumerian cuneiform had become a full writing system mixing logograms, signs representing whole words, with phonograms, signs representing sounds, complete with markers to clarify meaning and grammar. The physical act of writing cuneiform was more complex than it might appear. A scribe didn't simply press marks into clay randomly. The tablet had to be carefully prepared, rolled and folded and kneaded like bread dough, until it reached the right consistency, soft enough to take impressions clearly, but firm enough not to deform when handled. Ancient instructions that survive from Sumerian schools give us a glimpse of this process. Quick, come here, take the clay, knead it, flatten it, mix it, roll it like a ball, make it thick, make the tablet. The stylus itself, called tablet reed in Sumerian, was typically fashioned from arundo donax, giant reed, which grew abundantly in Mesopotamian marshlands. The scribe would cut it at an angle to create that characteristic wedge-shaped tip. Then came the actual writing, a process requiring constant rotation of the tablet and precise control of the stylus angle. Each sign consisted of multiple wedge impressions: vertical wedges, horizontal wedges, diagonal wedges, combined in patterns that could represent hundreds of different concepts and sounds. Students training to become scribes spent years mastering this art. They began by simply learning to make clean, properly proportioned wedges, practicing over and over until their hands knew the motions by muscle memory. Only then would they progress to actual signs and eventually to composing sentences. The round practice tablets that survive in museum collections today were deliberately made in that shape so they wouldn't be confused with official rectangular documents. Students could erase these and reuse them endlessly until they achieved proficiency. Once writing had developed to this level of sophistication, it transformed what could be remembered and transmitted. No longer did myth and law and history depend solely on oral tradition, vulnerable to the vagaries of memory. Now they could be fixed in clay, baked hard in kilns, stored in libraries where they might survive for millennia. The great literary works of Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, the Atrahasis flood story, the descent of Inanna, all come down to us because scribes pressed them into clay tablets that archaeologists would rediscover thousands of years later. And it was through these tablets that we would learn of the Anunnaki, their deeds preserved in wedge-shaped impressions that modern scholars painstakingly deciphered beginning in the 19th century. Without cuneiform, the Anunnaki would be utterly lost to history, their names never spoken again. Instead, we can still read the hymns sung in their honor, the myths that explained their origins, the legal formulas that called upon them as witnesses. The clay remembers what human memory has forgotten. Rising from the flat Mesopotamian plains, visible for miles in every direction, stood structures unlike anything the world had seen before. These were the Ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids of mud brick and baked clay, artificial mountains constructed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. They were not tombs like the Egyptian pyramids. They were not fortresses. They were temples, dwelling places for gods, sacred architecture designed to bring the divine realm within reach of mortal worshippers. The Ziggurats' form was instantly recognizable, a series of terraced platforms, each smaller than the one below, rising in steps to a flat summit where a shrine stood. The largest Ziggurats had 7 levels, though most made do with fewer. Stairs or ramps provided access to the upper levels, though exactly how they were arranged varies from structure to structure. Some Ziggurats had triple staircases converging on the first platform. Others used a single spiral ramp winding around the exterior. The exact configuration mattered less than the symbolism. These were stairways to heaven, paths by which priests could ascend toward the divine. Consider the great ziggurat of Ur, perhaps the best preserved example we have today, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE and completed by his son Shulgi. This massive structure measured roughly 210 feet by 150 feet at its base and rose over 60 feet high, possibly as high as 100 feet in its original state. Its corners aligned with the compass points with remarkable precision. The walls didn't rise perfectly vertical, but rather sloped slightly inward, creating an impression of solidity and strength, much like the later Parthenon in Greece would employ a similar optical refinement. The ziggurat's core consisted of sun-dried mud brick, millions upon millions of them, each one shaped by hand and dried in the Mesopotamian sun. But the outer face was covered in fired brick, baked in kilns to weatherproof the structure and protect it from the erosive forces of wind and rain. These facing bricks were sometimes glazed in different colors: blue, white, gold, black, creating patterns that may have held astrological or cosmological significance. Kings occasionally had their names stamped into these glazed bricks, a form of immortality through architecture. But why build such structures at all? The answer lies in Mesopotamian cosmology. The Sumerians believed their gods had originally come from the mountains, that primordial high places were the natural homes of divine beings. But southern Mesopotamia is essentially flat, a floodplain built from silt deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates over countless millennia. There are no mountains here, no natural high places. So the Sumerians built their own artificial mountains where the gods might feel at home. The ziggurat served multiple functions simultaneously. Most fundamentally, it was the dwelling place of the city's patron deity. At its summit stood a shrine containing the god's cult statue, an image believed to be more than mere art. It was the god's physical presence on earth, their body in the mortal realm. Only the highest-ranking priests could enter these summit shrines, where they would perform rituals, offer sacrifices, and communicate with the divine on behalf of the entire community. Some scholars have suggested additional purposes. Perhaps ziggurats served as observation platforms for astronomical calculations, allowing priests to track the movements of planets and stars with which specific gods were associated. Perhaps they provided refuge during seasonal floods, though this seems less likely given that the temples themselves were solid brick with no internal chambers. Perhaps they were simply displays of civic pride and religious devotion, monuments that proclaimed to everyone who saw them, "Here lives a god, and here we honor them properly." The ziggurat sat at the heart of a larger temple complex that might occupy several acres. Surrounding it were courtyards, storage rooms, workshops, living quarters for priests, and smaller shrines dedicated to associated deities. The temple complex wasn't just a religious center, but an economic engine. It owned vast tracts of agricultural land, employed hundreds or thousands of people, conducted trade, loaned grain and silver, and essentially functioned as a combination bank, warehouse, factory, and religious institution. The most famous ziggurat in history, though it no longer stands, was Babylon's Enki, whose name meant foundation of heaven and earth in Sumerian. This colossal structure, repeatedly rebuilt and expanded over centuries, measured approximately 300 feet square at its base and rose to a similar height through 7 levels. It was dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and it became so renowned that it's widely believed to have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Today, only about 25 ziggurats have been identified, their ruins scattered across Iraq and Iran. Most are heavily eroded, reduced to shapeless mounds that only experts can recognize as artificial structures. But even in ruin, they speak to the ambition and devotion of the people who built them, mortals who labored to bring heaven down to earth, to create a place where the Anunnaki might descend and dwell among their worshippers. If you had stood in Babylon during the spring festival celebrating the new year around 600 BCE, you would have witnessed one of the ancient world's most important religious ceremonies. On the 4th day of the 11-day Akitu festival, the high priest of Marduk's temple would enter the Holy of Holies and, before the statue of the god himself, recite from beginning to end a poem known as the Enuma Elish when above, named for its opening words. This wasn't entertainment. This was cosmic renewal, a ritual reenactment of creation itself, meant to ensure that the world would continue for another year, that the forces of chaos would remain defeated, that Marduk's sovereignty over gods and men would stand firm. The poem's recitation reaffirmed the fundamental order of reality. The Enuma Elish tells a story of creation emerging from conflict, of younger gods overthrowing elder powers, of chaos defeated by champions of order. It begins in the time before time, when nothing had names, when even heaven and earth did not exist as separate entities. There were only two primordial beings, Apsu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of the salt ocean. These two had mixed their waters together, a euphemism suggesting both literal and metaphorical mingling. And from their union emerged the first generation of gods. But these younger gods were noisy. They disturbed Apsu's rest with their boisterous activities. Frustrated, Apsu plotted to destroy his own offspring, so he might sleep in peace. His plan was discovered by Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, who responded with terrible efficiency. Using magic, Ea cast a spell that put Apsu into a deep slumber and then killed him. Ea then made his home upon Apsu's corpse, establishing his domain over freshwater, and with his wife Damkina, he fathered a son who would change everything. Marduk. Marduk was described as superior from birth, formed with supernatural excellence. He had 4 eyes and 4 ears, fire blazed from his lips. His stature was enormous, his power unprecedented. While Ea was clever and Enlil was mighty, Marduk combined all divine qualities in their highest forms. He was, quite literally, the perfect god. Tiamat, meanwhile, was furious over Apsu's death. Stirred to vengeance by other gods who resented the younger generation, she gave birth to an army of monsters, dragons and serpents, demons and beasts, creatures of nightmare given terrible reality. At their head she placed Kingu, whom she married and to whom she gave the Tablet of Destinies, the ultimate symbol of cosmic authority. With this tablet, Kingu could decree fates, control reality itself. The younger gods panicked. Even Ea, who had defeated Apsu, quailed before Tiamat's monstrous host. They needed a champion, someone powerful enough to face the primordial ocean and her demon army. Marduk stepped forward and made them an offer. He would fight Tiamat, but only if they agreed to make him king of the gods, supreme above all others, his word law, his authority absolute. The gods agreed. They granted Marduk power over destiny itself, confirmed by a test. He spoke to a constellation, commanding it to disappear. And it did. He commanded it to return. And it did. With this proof of his cosmic authority, Marduk armed himself with winds and storms, with lightning and floods, with weapons both conventional and magical. And he went to face Tiamat. The battle was apocalyptic. Tiamat opened her jaws to swallow Marduk, but he sent the evil wind into her throat, filling her body with tempest until she couldn't close her mouth. Then he shot an arrow down her gullet, splitting her heart, killing the primordial ocean mother. Her demon army scattered. Marduk captured Kingu, took the Tablet of Destinies for himself, and turned his attention to Tiamat's corpse. Here the poem becomes explicitly cosmological. Marduk split Tiamat's body like a shellfish, using half to create the sky and setting guards there to ensure the waters above wouldn't flood down. From the other half, he fashioned the earth. Her eyes became the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Her tail he coiled into the Milky Way. Every part of her body was repurposed, transformed from chaos into cosmos, from threat into structure. Then came the organization of the divine realm. Marduk assigned the Anunnaki their stations and duties. According to the Enuma Elish, he divided them into 2 groups. 300 Anunnaki for duty, in the heavens, controlling celestial phenomena, and 300 for duty in the underworld, managing the realm of the dead. A total of 600 Anunnaki gods, each with their assigned role in maintaining cosmic order. But Marduk wasn't finished. The gods complained that they needed servants, beings to perform the labor of maintaining the world. So Marduk took Kingu, Tiamat's defeated general, and had him executed. From Kingu's blood, mixed with earth. Ea created humanity. Humans existed to serve the gods, to perform the agricultural labor, the temple rituals, the sacrifices that the gods required. In return, the gods would protect humanity, ensure the fertility of fields, maintain the order of the seasons. The grateful Anunnaki then built Babylon itself as Marduk's earthly dwelling. They constructed his temple, the great Esagila, and they proclaimed his 50 names, each one an aspect of his power and authority. The poem ends with exhortations that this story be preserved, that fathers teach it to sons, that it never be forgotten. The Enuma Elish was more than mythology. It was political propaganda, religious justification, and cosmic charter all at once. Marduk had not always been the supreme god. In earlier Sumerian traditions, that honor belonged to Enlil. But, as the city of Babylon rose to political dominance in Mesopotamia, its patron god had to be elevated correspondingly. The Enuma Elish explained why Marduk deserved supremacy, not through mere assertion, but through a story of cosmic heroism, of a champion who saved the gods themselves and earned kingship through courage and power. In ancient Mesopotamia, there was no separation between religious and political authority. Kings didn't merely rule by divine right. They were the gods' chosen administrators on earth, the mortal links between heaven and human society. This connection between divine will and earthly governance ran through every aspect of Mesopotamian civilization, from the grandest royal inscriptions to the humblest administrative records. Consider the famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the most important legal documents to survive from the ancient world, carved into a black stone stele around 1750 BCE. It contains some 282 laws covering everything from property disputes to family relations to criminal penalties. But, before any of these laws appear, the stele shows Hammurabi himself standing before the seated figure of Shamash, the sun god who governed justice. Shamash extends his hand to Hammurabi, symbolically giving him the authority to establish law. The message was clear. These weren't merely Hammurabi's personal decrees. They carried divine sanction, the approval of the cosmic order itself. This same pattern repeated throughout Mesopotamian history. Kings claimed divine selection, divine guidance, even divine ancestry. Some monarchs went so far as to proclaim themselves gods during their lifetimes, particularly during the Ur-III period, when King Shulgi declared his own divinity. More commonly, rulers positioned themselves as the gods' faithful servants, the ones chosen to maintain order, build temples, ensure proper worship, and protect the land from chaos. The Anunnaki featured prominently in these royal ideologies. Kings would invoke them in their inscriptions, calling upon the Anunnaki to witness their achievements, to curse anyone who might damage their monuments, to bless their reigns with prosperity. Treaties between nations called the Anunnaki as divine guarantors, ensuring that oaths would be kept and agreements honored. To break such treaties wasn't merely political betrayal. It was sacrilege, an affront to the cosmic order. Temple economies formed the backbone of Mesopotamian urban life. The great temple complexes weren't just religious centers, but massive economic institutions that owned fields, employed workers, controlled trade networks, and effectively functioned as proto-banks. The gods themselves were understood to be the true owners of this wealth, with human administrators managing it on their behalf. Temple records meticulously tracked every grain of barley, every sheep, every jar of oil that flowed through these divine estates. This interweaving of religion, politics, and economics created a remarkably stable civilization that endured for thousands of years. When we read myths like the Enuma Elish, we're not just encountering abstract stories about gods. We're seeing the ideological foundation upon which entire societies were built. The cosmic narrative that explained why kings ruled, why laws existed, why people worked in temple fields and brought offerings to ziggurat shrines. The myths of the Anunnaki didn't remain static. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved, passing through different cultural phases and political configurations, so too did the stories and understanding of these divine beings. What began as Sumerian religious traditions were adopted, adapted, and transformed by the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and other peoples who claimed Mesopotamia as their homeland. When Akkadian-speaking Semites gradually gained influence in Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BCE, they didn't reject Sumerian gods. Instead, they translated them, giving them Akkadian names and incorporating them into their own religious framework. An became Anu, Enki became Ea, Inanna became Ishtar. But these weren't simple name changes. Subtle shifts in emphasis and characterization came with the linguistic transition. The Babylonians, who spoke a dialect of Akkadian, made perhaps the most significant transformation by elevating Marduk to supreme status. Earlier, Sumerian traditions had granted that position to Enlil, but Babylonian theology, as expressed in texts like the Enuma Elish, explained Marduk's supremacy as earned through cosmic heroism. This wasn't the Babylonians rejecting the older Sumerian gods. It was them incorporating those traditions into a new hierarchy that reflected Babylon's political dominance. The Assyrians in northern Mesopotamia followed a similar pattern. They venerated the Sumerian-Babylonian pantheon, but occasionally substituted their national god Ashur into positions where other texts placed Marduk. Different versions of the Enuma Elish exist, where Ashur, rather than Marduk, defeats Tiamat and creates the world. This flexibility demonstrates how mythology served political purposes while maintaining recognizable continuity. These Mesopotamian religious concepts also spread beyond Mesopotamia proper. The Hurrians and Hittites to the north, the Elamites to the east, all showed influence from Sumerian Babylonian mythology. They might add their own local deities, create new myths, emphasize different aspects, but the fundamental concepts of divine hierarchies, cosmic battles, creation through conflict, and gods who dwelt in temples and decreed human fates, these spread throughout the ancient Near East. Most intriguingly, scholars have long noted striking parallels between Mesopotamian myths and the Hebrew Bible. The creation account in Genesis, the flood story of Noah, the Tower of Babel, all have clear antecedents in earlier Mesopotamian literature. This shouldn't surprise us. The ancient Israelites existed in a cultural context saturated with Mesopotamian influence. When their ancestors lived in Babylon during the 6th century BCE exile, they would have been exposed to texts like the Enuma Elish, to myths of Atrahasis, to the cultural legacy of Sumerian civilization. The biblical writers didn't simply copy these stories. They transformed them, reinterpreting cosmic myths through a monotheistic lens, sometimes reversing their meanings. Where the Enuma Elish celebrated Marduk for defeating the primordial ocean Tiamat, Genesis depicted God bringing order to the waters through speech alone, no combat necessary. Where Mesopotamian myths explained humanity's creation as an afterthought to provide servants for gods, Genesis portrayed humans as created in God's image, the pinnacle of creation. These weren't plagiarism, but theological argument. Familiar stories retold to make very different points. In 1976, a writer named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet, claiming that ancient Sumerian texts revealed a startling secret. The Anunnaki were not gods at all, but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru. According to Sitchin, these aliens came to Earth about 500,000 years ago seeking gold, genetically engineered Homo sapiens as a slave species to mine it for them, and established the first human civilizations to organize their workforce. Everything humans achieved in ancient times, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, was supposedly taught to us by these alien Anunnaki. Sitchin's ideas exploded in popularity, spawning countless imitators and expanding into a vast pseudo-scholarly mythology about ancient astronauts, alien intervention in human history, and lost advanced technologies. Television shows have built entire series around these concepts. Books promoting these theories appear regularly. Internet communities discuss them with passionate conviction. The ancient aliens' interpretation of the Anunnaki has become, in some circles, almost as widespread as the original Mesopotamian mythology. There's just one problem. It's completely wrong. Professional scholars who can actually read cuneiform, who have spent decades studying Mesopotamian languages and texts, universally reject Sitchin's interpretations. They point out that he systematically mistranslated Sumerian words, mined passages out of context, invented etymologies that don't exist, and fundamentally misrepresented what the texts actually say. Sitchin claimed expertise in ancient languages, but lacked formal training in Assyriology, the academic field that studies these texts. When actual Assyriologists examine his work, they find error after error, mistranslation after mistranslation. For example, Sitchin translated certain Sumerian terms as rocket ships and aviation, when they actually referred to nothing of the sort. He claimed Sumerian texts described a 12th planet in our solar system, when no such astronomical knowledge appears in these sources. He interpreted standard Mesopotamian mythological language about gods descending from heaven as literal descriptions of spacecraft, when the texts were using conventional religious imagery. Why do these theories persist despite their scholarly rejection? Partly because they're exciting. The idea that aliens built the pyramids or that ancient gods were astronauts adds mystery and drama to history, partly because they flatter modern audiences by suggesting that ancient peoples couldn't have achieved their remarkable accomplishments without outside help, a deeply problematic assumption that diminishes the ingenuity and capability of early civilizations. And partly because legitimate archaeology can seem dry and complicated compared to the sensational narratives of pseudo-archaeology. But here's what's truly fascinating. The real Anunnaki mythology, accurately understood, is far more interesting than Sitchin's aliens. The actual Mesopotamian beliefs reveal how the world's first urban civilization grappled with fundamental questions about existence, power, morality, and humanity's place in the cosmos. They show us people creating sophisticated theological systems, developing political theories, establishing legal codes, and preserving these ideas through an invention, writing, that would change human civilization forever. The Anunnaki weren't extraterrestrials. They were expressions of human hopes and fears, projections of political power onto the cosmic scale, attempts to explain natural phenomena and social hierarchies, and ultimately, reflections of the people who believed in them. That's not less miraculous than ancient alien theories. It's more so because it's real. More than 4,000 years separate us from the priests who first pressed cuneiform signs into clay tablets to record hymns to the Anunnaki. The Ziggurats are ruins now, their baked bricks scattered or buried under millennia of accumulated earth. The last person who could read cuneiform naturally, without scholarly training, died sometime in the 1st century CE. For well over 1,000 years, these texts lay silent and incomprehensible. Yet, here we are, still speaking the names of An and Enlil and Enki, still reading their myths, still drawing meaning from stories first told when writing itself was newly invented. The Anunnaki have survived not as living gods but as cultural memory, as historical record, as part of the great conversation humanity has been having with itself about divinity and power and meaning since we first began to wonder why things are the way they are. What the Anunnaki mythology reveals, above all, is the remarkable sophistication of early human thought. These were not simple people with simple beliefs. They developed complex theological systems, understood astronomical phenomena with impressive accuracy, created legal codes that balanced justice with practicality, built architectural marvels that still inspire awe, and invented writing to preserve their ideas for future generations. When we read that the Anunnaki decreed the fates, we're encountering one of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to explain causation, to understand why events happen as they do. When we learn that Marduk earned kingship by defeating chaos, we're seeing political theory expressed through mythological narrative. When we study ziggurats and temple rituals, we're witnessing the birth of institutional religion as a force that could organize communities, accumulate resources, and provide structure to social life. The legacy of Mesopotamian civilization extends far beyond the myths themselves. The cuneiform script they invented would be adapted to write numerous languages. Their astronomical observations laid foundations for later mathematical and scientific traditions. Their legal codes influenced subsequent law throughout the ancient Near East. Their architectural innovations in brick construction and vault design would echo through millennia. Their myths would be retold, reinterpreted, and incorporated into new religious traditions that would spread across the world. Even today, in ways we rarely consider, we live within patterns first established in ancient Mesopotamia. Our 7-day week comes from Babylonian astronomy, where 7 celestial bodies were tracked and associated with gods. Our base 60 time measurement, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, derives from Sumerian mathematics. Our alphabets ultimately trace back, through various transformations, to writing systems that first developed in this region. The very concept of written law, of contracts and legal codes that transcend individual rulers, owes much to Mesopotamian innovations. And the questions the Anunnaki myths addressed remain our questions. Why does the world exist? Where did humanity come from? What is the relationship between earthly power and transcendent authority? How should societies be organized? What are our obligations to each other and to forces greater than ourselves? The specific answers the ancient Mesopotamians proposed may no longer satisfy us, but the questions themselves remain profoundly relevant. Perhaps that's the deepest legacy of the Anunnaki mythology. Not the specific stories about Marduk defeating Tiamat or Enlil separating earth from sky, but the act of creating those stories in the first place. The Sumerians and their successors demonstrated that humanity could look at the cosmos and construct systematic explanations, could observe social patterns and encode them in law, could imagine divine realms that reflected and justified earthly arrangements. They showed that culture and civilization were possible, that writing could preserve thought across generations, that monuments could outlast their builders. In the quiet darkness before sleep, as we settle into stillness and let our thoughts drift, perhaps there's something fitting about contemplating these ancient gods and their worshippers. They remind us that we are part of a long human story, that our ancestors were clever and thoughtful and creative, that they faced their world with courage and built something that endured. The Anunnaki are gone, their temples fallen, their last believers dust for centuries, but the ambition and imagination that created them persist in us, their distant descendants, still asking questions, still seeking meaning, still building civilizations upon foundations they helped lay. The rivers still flow in Mesopotamia, though under different names now. The sun still rises over the plains where Ziggurats once stood, and somewhere, perhaps, in museum basements and university libraries, clay tablets wait to be read, carrying within their wedge-shaped impressions more stories of the Anunnaki, more glimpses into the minds of our ancient kin, more evidence of humanity's long conversation with the divine. If you found this journey through ancient mythology interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more stories to explore, more civilizations to discover, more questions to ask about our shared human past. Thank you for listening, and may your own journey through history be filled with wonder and discovery.